Hello and welcome to Session 9 of the 5-Minute Bible Guides. In Session 8, we looked at some of the alternative Christian groups that use the Bible, but who have fundamentally different views of what the Bible is and how to interpret it correctly. In this session, we're going to be taking a closer look at the languages of the Bible. So, I have said a couple of times before in this series that the original languages of the Old Testament were Hebrew and Aramaic. The vast majority of the Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew. Hebrew was the language spoken by the ancient Israelites from the time of Moses until their exile to Babylon. However, from the 6th century BC until the 20th century, Jews stopped using Hebrew in everyday speech because they were dispersed among many nations. But they never completely lost its use because they studied it in order to read the scriptures. In the early 20th century, Hebrew was revived and modified as the main official language of the state of Israel, and it was adopted when the state was established in 1948. Now, I'm not an expert in Hebrew, but as I understand it, there are important differences between the Hebrew of the Bible and the modern Hebrew spoken of in Israel today. A few portions of the later books of the Old Testament, such as certain chapters in Daniel and Ezra, as well as a single verse in the book of Jeremiah, were written in a Semitic language related to Hebrew called Aramaic. Since Aramaic was the language of the Babylonian Empire, it became widespread in the ancient Middle East and displaced many other languages, including Hebrew. The Jews who returned to the Promised Land from exile in Babylon spoke Aramaic, and it was probably the everyday language spoken by Jesus and the disciples. Some Aramaic words were used by the gospel writers in the New Testament, especially when they directly quoted something Jesus said in that language. For example, Jesus' words from the cross are in Aramaic. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. My God, why have you forsaken me? So how about the New Testament? If you ask the average person on the street what language the New Testament books were written in, many would guess that they might have been written in Latin. I mean, that makes sense to some people because they would think that, well, Latin was the language of the city of Rome, which dominated the Mediterranean world at the time, and there was an early Latin translation of the Bible, indeed, in the 2nd century. But no, it isn't Latin. The writers chose Greek. Why Greek? Well, the answer is actually very simple. They wrote in Greek because it was the language of government, commerce, and education in much of the Eastern Mediterranean world during the 1st century AD when the New Testament books were written. Now think about it. In order to get the Christian message out to the largest group of people at the time, the Koine, or common Greek of the day, was by far the best choice. A Greek-speaking traveler could go from Spain or Britain in the west all the way to Persia in the east and find people who could read or understand Koine Greek. Greek was actually more universal in much of the Roman Empire than was Latin, the actual language of Rome. And clearly some writers like the Apostle Paul were fluent in Greek because they were raised and educated in a Greek environment. But why Greek when many of the earliest Christians probably spoke Aramaic as their native language? Well, there's good evidence that some of the writers of the New Testament books, like Peter and John, who were raised in Jewish-dominated lands and were not educated in the Greek system, also spoke enough Greek to travel and at least do business. So Greek was the obvious choice. Some interesting facts about these languages of the Bible. Both Hebrew and Greek use completely different alphabets than English does. English, as well as most other modern European languages, uses a modified form of the Latin alphabet. Now, the Greek alphabet is still used in Greece, but we also use it for certain mathematical and scientific symbols like pi in math. The Greek alphabet is certainly different, but once you familiarize yourself with it, the letters and their sounds are not that hard to learn. Hebrew, well, that's another story entirely. The Greek letters are at least related to our Latin-based alphabets, and some of them are pretty similar to Latin letters, but Hebrew is far more distantly related. At first glance, the Hebrew characters look nothing like our letters, so learning them is a lot more work, at least it was for me. Another odd feature about Hebrew for Westerners is that ancient Hebrew had no consistent vowel characters. They have what I call vowel indicators, but certain of these letters like aleph and ayin can make several distinct vowel sounds, kind of like English. The Greek language is very precise, on the other hand, in some ways. Remember that it's the original language of Western philosophy, so it was almost tailor-made for the theological concepts of the New Testament. Greek grammar and sentence construction are also very exact in most cases, so it's less prone to the kinds of misunderstandings that come from simple misreadings of the text. People may debate interpretations of the various concepts taught in the New Testament, but for the most part, what the sentences are actually saying is pretty clear. Okay, in the next session, we'll be considering what the Bible has to say about itself. Until then, this is Dr. Michael Bogart for the 5-Minute Guides to the Bible.